Something breaks long before anyone calls it breaking. It doesn't shatter. It doesn't scream. It goes quiet in a way that's almost polite. So polite that even you miss it at first. The earliest sign is an emotional pain. It's friction. A strange resistance to things that once felt automatic. Someone speaks and you hear every layer beneath their words, but instead of leaning in, something inside you stiffens. Not out of anger, not out of fear. Out of recognition you can't place. Your chest tightens, not sharply, just enough to register. Like a door that used to swing open, now catching slightly on the frame. You pause before responding, not because you don't know what to say, but because saying it feels heavier than it should. This pause feels wrong. You were never the one who paused. You were the one who moved toward feelings, toward confusion, toward emotional noise. You were the one who could sit in discomfort without flinching. So why now does your body pull back before your mind does? At first, you try to override it. You tell yourself nothing has changed. You still care. You still notice. You still understand. And all of that is true. The noticing hasn't dimmed. If anything, it's sharper than ever. What's changed is what happens next. Where you once flowed forward, you now hover. Where you once absorbed, you now hover at the edge of absorption. Like a hand stopping just before touching a hot surface. This isn't numbness. Numbness is blank. This feels precise, controlled, almost strategic, though you never planned it. People might say you're becoming distant. You might even think it yourself. But distance doesn't quite describe it. You're still there. Still listening, still attuned. You just aren't entering the emotional field the way you used to. There's an internal sense of enough that appears suddenly and without explanation. Enough listening, enough holding, enough translating someone else's inner weather. Enough. That word may not cross your mind consciously, but your body knows it. It knows when to stop leaning forward. It knows when to stay upright instead of bending. This is confusing because it contradicts everything you believed about yourself. You were the one who could handle more, the one who didn't need limits, the one who could sit with anyone, anywhere, no matter how heavy it got. You may have even taken pride in that capacity, not in an ego-driven way, in a quiet, functional way. This is just how I'm built, you told yourself. This is what I'm good at. So when the internal shutdown begins, it feels like betrayal of others, of yourself. You start asking silent questions you don't want answers to yet. Why does this feel intolerable now? Why am I suddenly irritated by things I used to understand effortlessly? Why do I feel drained even when I haven't done anything? You might try to fix it, push past it, reopen the internal door. But when you do, the resistance returns stronger, clearer. Like a warning light you can't ignore anymore. This is where discomfort deepens, because the shutdown doesn't come from lack of compassion. It comes from an excess of it. You still feel everything. You just don't want to carry it. And that distinction unsettles you. You notice yourself emotionally bracing in advance of interactions, not because of the people themselves, but because of what you know will be asked of you without being asked. Your presence has always been an invitation. People sense it. They open. They unload. They lean. They expect you to hold. And for a long time, you did. Now, something in you resists being the landing place, not with anger, with silence. There's a physical quality to this silence. It's not empty, it's dense, like pressure building behind a dam. You begin conserving your reactions, smiling less, responding slower, offering fewer emotional cues, not to punish anyone, not to manipulate, simply because your system no longer volunteers itself the way it once did. This change confuses people who knew you as endlessly available. They may push harder, sensing the shift, or they may pull away, assuming you no longer care. Neither reaction feels accurate to you. Inside, you feel alert, awake, almost hyper-aware of what crosses your internal threshold. You notice how often conversations revolve around unprocessed emotion, how often you're expected to metabolize feelings that aren't yours, how often your role has been to soften reality for others. Once you notice this, it becomes impossible to unsee. And with that awareness comes a new kind of exhaustion. Not the tiredness of effort, but the fatigue of repetition, the sense that you've been playing the same emotional role for so long that it's worn a groove into you. The shutdown doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in layers. First, you stop offering reassurance automatically. Then you stop explaining yourself. Then you stop feeling compelled to repair emotional disturbances that aren't yours to repair. Each layer feels slightly wrong at first, slightly selfish, slightly cold. But with each layer, there's also relief. Relief that surprises you. That relief is what scares you most, because it suggests that what you called empathy may have been costing you more than you realized. And that what you're experiencing now, this quiet withdrawal, might not be a malfunction, it might be a correction. Still, you don't have language for it yet. So you sit in the confusion, in the contradiction of caring deeply while no longer wanting to participate emotionally the way you once did. You may even test yourself, throw yourself back into intense emotional spaces to see if the old reflex returns. Sometimes it does briefly, but it drains you faster now, leaves you hollow instead of fulfilled. That's when a darker question creeps in. What if I can't go back? What if this shutdown is permanent? The idea is unsettling because so much of your identity was built around emotional openness. If that closes, even partially, who are you and what made it close? The answer doesn't come yet. Only the sensation does. Sensation of a door slowly, firmly closing from the inside. There's a point where confusion turns into recognition and recognition into something harder to swallow. You begin to see that the shutdown didn't happen because you felt too little. It happened because you felt too much for too long without protection. Here's the truth that changes a super empath permanently. And it rarely arrives gently. What shuts you down forever isn't being hurt once. It isn't betrayal. It isn't abandonment. Those things wound, but they don't shut you down. What shuts you down is repeated emotional exposure without reciprocity. It's realizing slowly and painfully that your capacity to feel has been used as infrastructure. You were the place others rested, processed, unloaded, stabilized. Your emotional openness became a resource. And resources get depleted when they're treated as infinite. This is where the psychological shift becomes irreversible. At some point, your system learns that openness equals vulnerability without safety. That being emotionally available means being entered, altered, and left unchanged on the other side. And once that lesson is learned at a deep level, something fundamental changes. The shutdown is not a choice, it's a safeguard. This is the part that's unsettling because it reframes everything. Your withdrawal is not a failure of empathy. It's empathy refusing to self-destruct. What looks like coldness is actually your sensitivity rerouting itself away from damage. You didn't become less caring, you became less accessible. And accessibility is not the same thing as compassion. The thing that shuts a super empath down forever is the moment they realize that feeling deeply does not guarantee being treated gently. That realization lands like a quiet verdict. From that point on, your emotional system stops volunteering itself without consent. It stops merging automatically. It stops assuming responsibility for other people's internal states. This is not a boundary you announce. It's a line that forms internally and stays there. You still feel everything. But now, there's a pause between feeling and engagement, a pause that didn't exist before. That pause is everything. It means you can perceive without absorbing, understand without internalizing, care without caring. But here's the cost. Some people only knew you as a place to put their emotions. When that place closes, even partially, they experience it as loss. They may accuse you of changing, of becoming distant, of being less warm. They are responding to the absence of your emotional labor, not the absence of your humanity. This is painful to see because it reveals which connections were built on mutual presence and which were built on your overextension. The shutdown becomes permanent not because you want it to be, but because reopening without change would mean returning to harm. Your system knows this, even if your mind struggles to accept it, and so the shutdown holds not rigidly, not defensively, but firmly. You may still open selectively, carefully with discernment. But the days of unlimited emotional access are over. That's what makes it permanent. Once you understand that your empathy requires containment to survive, you cannot unknow it. The unsettling truth is that some parts of you will never return to how they were. The innocence of emotional openness without consequence is gone. What replaces it isn't hardness, it's clarity. But clarity comes with grief. Grief for the version of you who believed love meant limitless access. Grief for the times you gave without being held. Grief for the emotional depth that was treated as public property. The shutdown protects you, but it also isolates you in subtle ways. Fewer people get close, fewer connections feel effortless, and yet those that remain feel different, cleaner, more grounded, less draining. Still, there's no triumphant ending here. You may still miss the version of yourself who could feel everything without flinching. You may still wish you could open the door fully without fear of depletion, but your system remembers what that cost. So the door stays partially closed, not out of bitterness, out of wisdom that arrived through exhaustion. The unresolved truth you're left with is this: you didn't lose your empathy, you lost the ability to ignore what it does to you. And once you see that, once you feel that, you can't go back. The question that remains isn't whether the shutdown was necessary. It's whether you're willing to accept that some forms of openness are no longer compatible with your survival. That question doesn't demand an answer right now. It just waits quietly inside the space you no longer give away.